Okay, I'm back and the cranberry sauce is ready. If you plan on using a mason jar, you should look for a 1 pint jar that accommodates the full bag of cranberries just perfectly. So this is a regular size bag that you're going to get in the grocery store. And if you strain it, it will reduce to 1 cup, which fills a 1 pint jar. So there's that. Now, we're going to get started with our apple pie. And I have an anecdote to share with you about apple pie as soon as I finish up this first part. So one of the keys to making a really flavorful, complex apple pie is to use a variety of apples. So I'm going to wash and peel these in a minute, but I have here, what kind is this? Hold on. So this is a Honeycrisp. This, of course, is a Granny Smith. And then this one with the speckled skin is a European apple I'd never seen before. So that's why I picked it up in a grocery store, because it had kind of a cool mottled texture to the skin, if you can see that. But I can't remember the name of it right now. But anyway, I have 3 different kinds of apples that I'm going to use in this pie. So yes, using the different apples does give the pie more complexity, more nuance in the flavor. But I have to be honest that my reason for mixing up the apples is not entirely based on any culinary principles. I have a very personal reason for using more than Granny Smith apples. So I have a cousin who is also my best friend, and we are the same age, and we've grown up together and done everything together. Every step of our lives, we've sort of gone through the same rites of passage and rituals together. So, you know, we were debutantes at the same time. We graduated high school at the same time. We're both attorneys, so we were in law school roughly at the same time. She is now married and she has 2 sons, and her sons are, in addition to being my cousins, my godsons. And the youngest godson is now 5, but 2 Thanksgivings ago, he was 3, and he just started pre-K 3 in September. So I happened to be visiting them, and my cousin mentioned to me that the boy was learning about different kinds of apples in his class, and that his teacher had created a whole curriculum around apples. So they were learning how to add, and if you have 1 apple plus 1 other apple, how many apples do you have? 2. So this whole week, the curriculum was surrounded by apples. So we happened to be on our way to Target when she was sharing this story with me. And I was like, you know what we should do? We should make him an apple pie. And she was like, oh, that's a great idea. So I go to Target and I pick up a bag of Granny Smiths. And I'm at home preparing the pie, peeling the apples, got the dough laid out, and the boy walks by, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm here making a pie for you. And he says, I don't like Granny Smith, and walked away. Yeah. So no more all Granny Smith apples. For a while, I was off Granny Smith entirely. Over the last year, I started to incorporate it more, but for that reason and for taste reasons, we're going to use a full array of apples. So let me wash these and prep them, and then we can get started on how to make this very straightforward, very easy pie, okay? All right, so we're ready to start with our apple pie. I've already cut and cored and peeled the apples. And the first thing that we're going to do in this part of the process is blind bake our pie crust. So I've encountered times when I've tried to make pie and I haven't blind baked the crust, and it comes out a little bit gummy or doughy. So in order to avoid that and to give that bottom layer of crust a chance to really crisp up a little bit, we're going to basically par bake it. So bake it just for about 7 or 8 minutes, so that when the apples go in and the second layer of crust goes atop it, it already has kind of a running start, an advantage, so that the whole pie is baked all the way through and that you don't have that soggy crust in the bottom. So as I mentioned, we are using store-bought crust. You can find this in the refrigerator section, like near the biscuits and refrigerated cookies. This is from Kroger, and you want the box that has 2 crusts in it. So as a start, you have to let these sit out for about 15 minutes before you use them, so that's why they're already open. But I'm just going to take this and roll it out on a piece of parchment paper. And we're still listening to Neo. Okay, then I'm going to take my pie plate and just invert this. Actually, let's do it this way. Just kind of invert this on the plate so that that crust gets in there and it's pretty even. And then I'm just going to kind of press it down gently into the sides. And this is a regular 9-inch pie crust. So I'm going to make sure there are no air pockets on the interior part. So I really want to kind of press along the edges to make sure that we don't have the crust sort of bubbling up. So once that's been done, what I'm going to do next is take a fork and prick the bottom of the pie crust. Okay, so I'm going to make a lot of evenly spaced little pricks. And what this is going to do is prevent that pie crust from puffing up in the middle while it's pre-baking. So you're giving the air somewhere to escape, and you're not going to have this giant mound in the middle of your pre-baked crust. And you want to do that around the edges too. And that's pretty much it. If you have pie weights, you can use pie weights instead of pricking it, but I would imagine that if you are enough of a baker to have pie weights, that you're not going to be using store-bought crust. So this is what it should look like. You have your little holes in there that you can see. So I'm going to put this into the oven. The oven's on 425 is what this recipe calls for. So 5 to 7 minutes tops. You're not trying to get this brown. You only want to get some of that doughiness out. So I'll place this in there, put the timer on, and then we're going to come back and start on the filling. All right, so now we're going to start on the filling. So as I mentioned, the apples have already been prepped, and now we're going to make a little bit of sauce to pour over them. So here I have 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, a 1/2 teaspoon of nutmeg, a 1/2 cup of brown sugar, and a 1/2 cup of white sugar, all mixed together. I also have 1 stick of butter, which is equivalent to a 1/2 cup, and 3 tablespoons of flour, and then 1 tablespoon, or excuse me, 1/4 of a cup rather of water. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is melt down the butter. So I'm gonna take my, let me just kind of get that in here. So as it's melting, I had been telling you guys a story of my little godson who dissed my Granny Smith. So I was crestfallen. I'm like, he's 3. I've been in here peeling apples for half an hour, making dough. And this little boy was like, oof, just, blew me off. So in my mind, I was like, well, once he smells it baking and he sees everyone else eating it, then he's gonna be converted. Like, he's not going to do the hard Heisman on the Granny Smith pie. But he did. So all weekend long, the rest of us are eating the pie, and he's still like, yeah, I don't fool with Granny Smith. And I was thinking to myself, this is the disadvantage to educating these kids properly, because 6 months before, an apple was an apple, it was an apple. But after this week of curriculum on apple types and tasting apples and so on and so forth, he now has a strong opinion on apples and won't eat auntie's pie. And I felt away. I still do, actually. But anyway, so our butter is melting. We're not trying to brown it. I know I recommend brown butter for a lot of recipes, but for this, we're really just melting. I'm going to turn up the heat so we can get into it. And the first thing that we will do in making this sauce is create a little paste. So I'm going to mix in the flour as soon as this butter is fully melted. Now, I've been playing around with these recipes quite a bit. At one point I was using like allspice and cloves and cinnamon and nutmeg, and it was just too much. The seasonings in that measure did not allow just the pure, clean taste of the apples to really shine. And since this is the time of year for apples, I think that you should really take advantage of, you know, things that are in season and let them do what they're going to do on their own without too much manipulation. So this is melting down nicely. So that's why I have refined this recipe and cut back on some of the spices. So we're just getting it to the point where it's all melted. And as soon as that last bit of solid melts, I'm going to add in the flour. All right, so we're here. You guys can see the butter's all melted. And I'm going to whisk in the flour. I'm going to keep stirring as I'm mixing it in so that it doesn't get clumpy. Okay, so now we have a paste. And this is really the same kind of way that you would make a roux if you were making gumbo, but we're not going to let it brown. So now we're going to add in our sugars, and add in the water. Okay, I'm just going to bring those to a boil very quickly. Make sure all of those sugars are incorporated so that we don't have any lumps. Okay, and that timer was for the blind baked pie crust. So I'm going to let this come back to a boil, grab the pie crust out of the oven, and then I'll be back and we can go through the filling. See you soon. All right, now we're ready to start with the crust, the second crust. So the first thing that we're going to do in this part of the activity is to make an egg wash. And an egg wash really does two things. It helps you to seal any edges, and it also gives like a nice shiny coat to the pie, so it'll have a beautiful sheen to it. If you want a more rustic looking pie, you can skip this step, but if you like that kind of sheen on your pie, then you'll want to add an egg wash. I'm going to use an egg wash that's made with a whole egg and some water, but you can do it with just the yolk, with yolk and cream, or you can just do one with cream or milk by itself. So I have one whole egg, and to that I'm going to add 1 tablespoon here of water. And you really want to make sure that you mix this together well, so that you have even coverage on the pie, and that you don't have any burnt bits on the pie where you have too much yolk or yolk that hasn't been incorporated. So we're just going to give that a nice stir. And then you want to break up any yolk clumps so that you have a nice sort of even pale yellow color. All right, so that part of it is done. We're going to reserve that until later. Now, the next step is creating our crust. And for this, we're gonna make a little fall foliage pie with cookie cutters, okay? So I'm gonna roll this out, and I have an assortment of like 4 different leaf shapes here. And I think I'm gonna give a shout out to our little, I'm from Michigan, Canada is our next door neighbor, so I'm gonna use a little maple leaf. And then I don't know what this is, maybe I don't know, oak. My friends who are into trees will know better than I. So I'm just going to cut out a bunch of shapes from this dough. And instead of having a regular lattice crust or full crust, we're going to make the crust from this dough, okay? So I will continue this, and then I'll be back when it's time to put this all together. But before I do that, I do want to add to the apple paste mixture, the apple syrup mixture that we made. I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of vanilla. So now that it's cooled a bit, I'm going to add it. If you add it sometimes when it's hot, it'll produce a lot of bubbles and it might kick back on you some. So that will be the last ingredient that goes into that sugar mix. So bear with me for a moment. I'm going to get the rest of these shapes cut out, and then I'll be right back.